here to talk about one of the work groups that I've been running for the last little bit. We've initially, and we'll get into the history, focused on payment and healthcare operations. That was the name of the work group. Those of you who participated in the past but didn't necessarily keep up. We evolved a little bit, but we think we went in a really good direction. So I have an amazing panel. I will introduce them soon. They're not just going to be here. I do like to roll with like a large posse, but this time I will introduce them all. So as far as background, like I mentioned, we started with payment and healthcare operations, of course. It's always been supported by Carequality, but what we found with non-treatment permitted purposes is that there just isn't as much uptake, generally speaking. So we wanted to start a work group to address that kind of lackluster response rate, we'll say. And we started by actually asking the question of the community, why aren't we doing this? And what we found was that there was a lack of specificity within healthcare operations and payment. There are technical limitations, so sometimes an organization just kind of had it shut off. And an inability to address minimum necessary concerns. That was one of the bigger ones that we dug into. We can get into that a little bit maybe as a panel of where our actual concerns led to there. So, like I mentioned, we surveyed the community. We actually found about 23 separate sub-use cases of payment and healthcare operations. That's based on their HIPAA definitions and also some other definitions we found in polling the community. We asked organizations well, particularly implementers, to rank them from 1 to 23, with 1 being the item of greatest interest. Our goal there was to determine, okay, where do you want us to start? Because we can't take the whole thing as one big pile and still be as specific as we would like to be. So we gave the options, and we heard back. We actually got, for a Carequality survey, a fairly good implementer response rate. So we got 9 implementer responses. The range was 41 to 151, reminding that lower means better or higher interest. Care coordination kind of ran the table against payment use cases. We saw a lot of interest in healthcare operation use cases, but particularly care coordination. So with that being our new priority, we continued moving the group. So we did a couple of things. Primarily, we had to define Carequality. Not define Carequality, we always have to define Carequality. We had to define care coordination. We have a new definition that takes in what we already see within HIPAA and adds a little bit more industry specificity and tweaking it just a tiny bit for the Carequality context. But we'll go into that. It's a big block text. You're going to hate it. There's a new permitted purpose. So one of the things that we found in our feedback from the implementer community is that instead of creating some new code for care coordination, they instead wanted us to put it kind of at the same level of treatment. So when the query comes in, you know, right off the bat, this is a care coordination query in the Carequality context. Then we also added transaction logs. This doesn't necessarily seem like it completely locks in with this, but we thought that it was really important for accountability and just making sure that there's strong audit logs. And we'll talk about it in a bit, but it's actually going to affect more than care coordination, which is an important point there. So, big block text. I'm sure this is going to be something that people will ask about. We have all of these available if you send us a message at admin@carequality.org. So, some of this language you're going to recognize, particularly if you're familiar with the HIPAA definition. Other bits we've added, like I mentioned. But importantly, this gives, at least from what the work group and feedback that we've gotten from implementers so far, it gives a level of specificity to responders that they are in a position to really understand what they're being asked for, and then make access decisions appropriately given that. So, and I will mention here that there's Q&A at the end, so keep those in mind if you have questions there. Draft language. This is particularly speaking to the idea of reciprocity. So in treatment, pretty easy, right? So we've always had an expectation of reciprocity within Carequality. If you are an initiator for treatment, the idea is that it's outside of a couple of initiator-only exemptions, you are responding. But that's not necessarily the case in care coordination. You have a lot of organizations who may not even have a concept of clinical documentation in the way that we exchange currently within query-based document exchange or even FHIR. So what do we do in those cases to still maintain some level of reciprocity? Well, we do something that has always been allowed within the implementation guide for non-treatment purposes, allow for fees. We're not specifying what those fees are. We're just saying that an organization that is in the responder role may not respond if they require instead a fee to be established with an organization. And this is not necessarily a fee per transaction, but more a fee, an agreement set up with another organization, typically an implementer. So that's a little bit new, but it's something that we've seen in the ecosystem for other purposes anyway. Audit logs, exciting. We're adding minimum required data. And if you'll notice, we're also adding this to treatment. We got feedback from the implementer community that there's interest in having audit logs available even within the more traditional treatment exchange within Carequality. As always, there's going to be some rollout time for all of this, but we are going to get into that as well. Next steps, community feedback. As always, everything with Carequality is consensus-based, right? So we run work groups. We have had a series of chats with Carequality staff about the policies, and those conversations are kept confidential as part of making sure that we can get honest feedback. We have been having those as time has gone on with this work group. So we are also planning a rollout survey. So that survey will give us a lot of the information that we need from the implementer community about how we go about timing-wise some of these things. So audit logs are going to affect everything. Making separate agreements for responder fees, things like that. We want to make sure that anything that we roll out matches with implementer expectations and actually match with reality. To be quite frank, we don't want to make a requirement that is too hard for all of our organizations to meet. So that was a lot, and I went rather quickly. I'm trying to make sure that there's a good amount of time for Q&A at the end, but we do have an amazing panel also, and I am going to bug them shortly after introducing them. So, too many papers. So, start with Matt Becker. Hi. So, he's the Vice President of Interoperability at Know2. He's also on our steering committee and participates in Commonweal, Direct Trust, HIMSS, and a bunch of other word salad, letter salad. He's in everything and knows everything that's going on. He's a good person to have when you're like me and don't know. So Justin McMartin is manager of clinical history and the direct product team at SureScripts. Plays an active role in Trust Framework community by participating in Direct Trust along with Carequality. Interestingly, and it's listed as just for fun, he's in law school. Yeah, we'll get into that. Also open to ask questions about that. And the second thing that's a fun fact about him, he's also raising a small herd of short-horned cattle in rural Minnesota. So
yeah, I mean, would love to chat about that as well.
Okay, next we have, and that is absolutely something we should talk about. Oh, did I hit something? Did we end? Okay. Whoa. remote has a little bit of a mind of its own, so I'm going to put it down because I don't trust it. Brian Tate leads clinical and interoperability data products across CVS Enterprise, including pharmacy, Aetna, Caremark, specialty, and other lines of business. He's also on the advisory council, so has a good pulse on what's going on with the implementer community. We have Derek Plansky, Senior Vice President of Product Development at Health Gorilla, previously the president and founder of Informatics Ideas, a consultancy firm, and vice president of product innovation, former vice president of product innovation at Sandlot Solutions. So, amazing panel. They know a lot more than me, so now I'm going to be quiet-ish. Let's start with, we're going to kind of run this work group-ish, where I say something kind of dull, and then everybody makes me more interesting. We have a lot of updates. There's a lot going on here. One of the things that we've talked about is the responder fees. Of course, this was always allowed in Carequality for non-treatment, but we haven't ever really formally addressed it outside of it being allowed, essentially. So how do you all feel things will change? Will they at all? Just generally from having a pulse on the implementer community, what do you think about responder fees generally?
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly start. I think one of the biggest things is it actually creates a level playing field for a lot of folks. And the fact that you're going to have different groups that want to do care coordination come up on this framework and be in different places in their interoperability lives, and really just allowing for different ways to either be reciprocal or to pay fees or whatever you need in order to actually get this moving is a huge step to get us off the ground and get everybody on that same playing field right away.
I mean, I would just add to it, is that there's just needs to be an acknowledgement that what we all do as organizations involved in this environment of interoperability, it costs money, and we need to make sure that we're ultimately funding that. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. So, yeah, I think it's incredibly important for us to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to say, it's great that it actually puts some sort of value on the interoperability, because then you can start doing more effective ROIs on, okay, well, should we actually start to contribute data for the organizations that don't yet? On the clinical side, you know, it's always been back and forth, but perhaps it's a way for payers to start having another incentive to contribute data like meds, history, and other things into the networks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, setting options. I mean, so there's a menu that has too many options, and then there's a menu that's just order whatever you want, right? And we were in that state of, well, just make it happen. And at least now there's some pathways that can be taken and saying, okay, well, here's the two categories. You know, choose a camp.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, and hoping you would all say that it's a good idea. We're a little far down the road to go back on that one.
I mean, I would also just add into it, like, because I mean, you mentioned in the data reciprocity side of it, right? That's also important. It's an important component of it, right? That's the foundation of what we've done with the Carequality framework, and I'm just really happy that we've also incorporated that into it. Also thinking of it in that way to say, really, the goal at the end of the day is we're all sharing data, right? But you know, to Matt's point, we're in different places, and we need to make sure that we're you know, greasing the wheels, so to speak, to get it moving.
It does remind me that we have within the draft policy that time-bound exclusion for payers that have less than, I think it was 25,000 lives that they represent. So we're still, even within that response fee format, trying to make sure that everyone can participate, that we're meeting prospective implementers where they are, rather than trying to force only some organizations that are present in the market to be able to participate. I think that's one thing that came out of the work group that is really understanding that there's a large, that the point here should be expanding the tent, essentially. We really want to engage as many organizations as possible for the betterment of healthcare and everything else, and We're good people. Okay, so maybe not as exciting, but still important, audit logs. Big lift, little lift, how, I see Brian's.
To be determined. I mean,
Yeah.
and it varies so much by each implementer, each organization. I guess speak for CVS. We certainly do, and this is a small lift for us. But it's forcing transparency, and transparency breeds trust. And as we go into additional purposes of use, and this is our trial run, hopefully that the ability to audit, breeds adoption.
Well, and this was one of the early concerns of the group is, how do we make trust outside of treatment and really move this forward? And audit logs were one of the first things to come up, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
It really was, hey, we need to know exactly the information on the other side. We need to be able to log consistently. And so whether it's a big lift or a small lift, it's an important one, and it just needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, the framework was built on, again, that kind of foundation of, wanting to be able to exchange data and do it in that reciprocal way, right? And it was always a trust but verify. And this puts another kind of component into that verify category to say, here's ways that I can also make sure that, we're comfortable with everything that's going on. And it takes it to that next level. The technology's there, the framework exists for us to be able to make these exchanges happen, but for us to move to that next level, we need to have the trust that both of these gentlemen said is just so important. And here's just one other way that we can do it. And I think, throughout it, we're probably going to find other things that we need to audit or verify as well. And that's kind of the whole point of where we're starting, right? We started with that survey. And care coordination fit the bill the best for everybody involved, and now we're taking those next steps to say here are some of those new things we have to do this, and we're going to find out other things along the way. So I think that audit trail also will help us identify those things.
Okay, so like I said before, this is a lot of movement in a good direction, particularly and very specifically, like you were mentioning, guided by the community and the feedback that we've been getting. The survey, making sure that we're meeting our implementer community where their desire is rather than what's the easiest technical move for us to make as an organization. Thinking of just kind of that same lift question, what do you think this is going to take from an implementer perspective to support care coordination in the level that we've really started to discuss in this work group?
I think it's actually going to be very uneven. I think certain implementers are going to have a much easier time, but then there's going to be the other side of the market where who's actually implemented to respond. So within our network, we know that there's a lot of demand for the care coordination. People are clamoring for it. We've turned away customers because they weren't, it wasn't explicitly treatment. So we know there's demand. We just want to make sure that the rest of the network starts sharing in that and enables it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and to Derek's point, there's just a big operational lift that needs to happen from, especially the folks that are just responding from treatment today. Education is certainly something that we're taking a big look at. Just making sure everybody's on board with what's coming and making sure that that's transparent to everybody so that we can hit the ground running and not having to explain ourselves a year later.
Yeah, and it's a combination of the things we've seen on the screen, right? I think the on behalf of component is really important to this whole implementation as well, because a lot of those care management organizations are working across boundaries in multiple different types of organizations, and we need to make sure that we have those ways of defining that. It's all bundled back into that trust component to make sure that we can actually implement it. But yeah, in terms of like a technical lift though, that piece is not the hard part here, right? I think that was something we've talked about a lot in this work group, is like the technical pieces aren't hard. It's that actual, making sure everybody's comfortable with what we're doing and the approach that we've taken, and education's a big component of that, and just introducing everyone to the changes we've made to help bring that level of trust up, to say this is something that we can do.
Well, just tying that back to the audit logs as well, we'll have the visibility to see the growth and the sort of hot spots or dark spots in the network as this gets implemented and rolled out, because it's not going to be perfectly even.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a lot, that will also be informed by some of that rollout scheduling, just to make sure that we're making our, establishing our required dates for adoption, getting that feedback. So, by the way, all implementers that are here, we're giving you the survey. So do give us the feedback and be honest about it, but maybe not so honest in the 3 years from now, that's when we can do this. But we do, it's important to mention that Carequality does really lean on the information and feedback from our implementers. So that's with our work groups, that's with when policy documents come out, giving feedback, whether that's this is great or something more redliney with, oh my God, we're leaving sort of feedback. We need all of it. So just keep that in mind when this new framework policies document draft comes out, that survey will be there. And it's really important for us to get the feedback about what your limitations are, what you see as barriers to rolling out both the things for care coordination, but also a couple of other things that we're going to ask you about when that red line comes out. Sorry, I went on a tangent. I also wanted to mention another tangent, because if you've been on work groups that I've run, you know that I do this sometimes. The on behalf of structure, we might end up going into it more, but that's essentially the idea that we're going to be bringing on more organizations that aren't, as we mentioned, Alan mentioned before, in that traditional treatment role where they're the direct organizations doing the treatment. They're somewhere in the middle where they're querying on behalf of an organization that's listed in the directory. There's way more complication in that, but I just wanted to give just kind of an overview because we mentioned it, and it is important to care coordination because we envision that there's going to be organizations that sit between like a payer, let's say, that aren't your traditional organizations within Carequality, but they have a really important role to play in grabbing records that need to get to a payer, but the payer isn't necessarily going to go and do all of that themselves. Okay. So what opportunities do you see, happy path, we get this running, this room doesn't revolt on us and come after us.
No pitchforks.
Yeah, no pitchforks. Just, you never saw me here. How do we see that going? What's the day after look like?
I think to start with, I mean, it's going to be this room that gets to see these changes first. Okay, so it's going to take a moment, and knowing how payers operate and their time schedules, it's going to be this room is going to experience the benefits day one. So where we have, and I'll speak for us and CVS, where we have Aetna care managers, they're going to be joining and eliminating some burdens that currently all of our participants experience. Okay, number two is we're going to be getting a whole different class and different set of participants joining, and they can choose that lane, the reciprocity lane or the fee lane. And what's exciting there is that the data is already being consumed by these new participants. It's just coming through a fax. Mm-hmm. It's not. There isn't anything new operationally, but it's happening over a different channel. And I think finally, the outcome is going to be that we learn a lot by adopting a new policy. By dipping our toe into adopting an entirely new use case where we've seen 100% adoption for treatment, we're going to learn a lot for a use case that's pretty safe. It isn't isn't prior authorizations that we're starting with. We're starting with care coordination, a quasi-treatment arm to begin with. So I think those are some of the immediate outcomes.
I will highlight here the impact on patients, right?
Absolutely.
In a lot of cases, when you start talking about care management organizations, they have a lot of time in front of patients. And today, we as an organization have done some work with a few of those few care management organizations, just understand the workflow and the challenges that folks have. And that access to information is just critical, right? Because they're trying to help a patient who's in a really complicated part of their lives in a lot of cases, because they've got a terrible diagnosis or are having challenges with some health issue, and are needing to be able to have that person say, yes, here's the right path for you. And so much of their time today is on just like, okay, what meds did you get prescribed? I didn't get that fax yet, or oh, I got it somewhere in my papers that I haven't gotten scanned in, or whatever it might be. And they're spending all that time just doing those kind of the remedial data understanding and not really being able to give that guidance. And that's really the impact that I want to see. And I'm hoping that in those first couple of days, we start to hear those stories of like, I had all this information at my fingertips. We were able to talk about this diagnosis. I changed that patient's life today in a lot of cases. That's what I want to see and what I think we'll see at the end of this.
I'm really just excited for just better integrated healthcare and folks coming to the table that haven't been on the Carequality table before. Care coordination is an excellent starter, as Justin was talking about, but there's so much more we can do in the future with the right people at the table, and this is a great start to give us a lot of the lessons learned we're talking about and things like that, but really working towards providers, payers, patients, everybody having the information they need at their fingertips at any given time. This is an amazing first step in getting that done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also a great way of reducing friction in that information flow, like comparing getting a fax and having to read it and mediate that through someone reading it or scanning it into a system versus having that information available, more or less instantaneously will improve patient care, it'll make things more efficient, it'll unleash innovation. There's just so much goodness that comes from that.
And the flip side of it too, that data reciprocity piece of it, the physicians and providers in their clinics getting their information back from those care managers to say, we did have this conversation, right? And that also has downstream impacts of, we're closing this gap in care. We made sure this person, actually picked up their statin and is taking it, and all of that sort of stuff, which I think is, again, some of those things where you're just maybe feel like you're checking boxes, but when that information isn't flowing back and forth, then we're wasting time meeting with the patient, talking about those things if they've already been addressed. And that, again, face-to-face time with patients is so critical that we can, remove that friction in this scenario on both sides of those relationships with the patient. I think it's going to be huge.
And we're assuming that the data is being transferred, right?
Right.
Yeah. I don't think it is.
Well,
It
yeah.
is in many cases, and I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're going to actually see patient studies come out of this and saying, hey, the organizations, the payers that join, are seeing some tangible benefit aside, from those that don't, and that's going to be really exciting to see.
So I just want to bring up the fact that Brian did talk me out of bringing a fax machine on stage and just beating it down Office Space style. So
Why? That would have been great.
That would have been fun. Great way to start the day.
yeah, but then we would have had to go full Gallagher and make a splash zone in front, and I'm sure we'd get well, that's fair. Nobody likes them anyway, so we just. Okay, so still think we should next year.
Next year,
Next year.
when it's done.
So another component of the work that we've done here, in the draft policy as proposed, there's care coordination and participation in it is tied to treatment, where if you're an initiator in one, you need to be a responder in the other. You need to participate, right? As implementers, as people with finger on the pulse of implementers, how do you all feel about that particular component of it? I know that's more of a hot button issue than some of the others. Is it? I know this is a biased panel.
Yeah.
I planned it that way.
It's less of a an issue certainly for us from a responding perspective, or getting our participants to respond. But I think there is some sensitivity in probably the more traditional provider space around that. And certainly anything we can do to assuage those concerns or help that along would be good overall for the network.
Yeah, and I think it's part of starting with care coordination, which was such a great idea of, this is quasi-treatment. These folks are treating patients. That's something we can sell pretty well. And making sure that folks get on board with that, and then we start to roll out more on top of that.
Continuing to make the case that this should be happening already,
Right, yeah.
right? I mean, it's just, it's less burden.
Yeah, I know that when we come up with policies that tie those two together, there tends to be a little bit of unease, and we do hear that whenever we do it. I tend to be the one that tries to pull the trigger on that first with policy writing. Dave knows. But it's an important step. I think that making sure that we're putting this out there in a way that everybody knows the ground rules, and everybody that's playing in one field knows that they have a responsibility of playing in another, is kind of key to getting this rolling. Because like you were saying, Justin, this is going to have an effect on patients. This is what we're here to do effectively. So we roll out. I know we talked a little bit about what the next step is for that, and what that world looks like. From your own organizations, do you have any thoughts on how this will affect your specific organizations? I know we talked a little bit about that, but we kind of talk about it more in a global sort of Carequality sense. Any thoughts, anything? This is non-binding.
From our side, we've seen enthusiasm, we've seen folks interested in that. We're eager to get it rolling. So we're very stoked about that prospect.
Plus one, how pharmacy fits into all of this is the big thing that we're really trying to unravel, or set a precedent for. Pharmacy has been kind of off to the side. I mean, there's there's med lists, right? But then there's fill history. Who's taking what was filled when, and we're partnership with my colleague Jen Murray. We're trying to figure out like how pharmacy kind of fits into this broader picture as a participant, as a care provider.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest change for us is really kind of to the point Derek made earlier around the folks in the organizations we get to work with to help get them involved in Carequality, right? That's going to be the biggest change, is we get to go and say yes to a few folks that we've been having to say no to for a while because it isn't been well understood, or we don't have a pathway. And now we have, with this, if we get everything approved and through, we have a pathway, and that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think to Brian's point, just to take it a slightly broader view of it, like care is changing across our country, right? We have a primary care issue in this country. We have a lot of physicians that are stepping away from that role, and pharmacists may be a way to step in. More folks in this care management world are likely going to step in and fill some of those roles, and we need to make sure that they've got access to the right data. And I think, so tying it to the change that we have to find the ways to identify and bring those folks into this fold so that they get access to that information. And I think that'll be the biggest change for our organization. Like I said earlier, the technology piece of it, this is easy, right? This is why we built this framework, is so that we could build on things like this onto it to make sure information gets exchanged. So yeah, that's what I'm excited about, and I think our biggest change.
Yeah, and you want to talk about staffing shortages, our leap into long-term care and skilled nursing facilities and stuff. O2 has been interesting, and it's another benefit for our groups, because at the end of the day, they're not having to go and chart chase themselves and fax something over and things like that. And this can really be not just sold to them as an advantage for them overall, but at the same time, they're getting those folks playing in the space that maybe not have done that before, once we get that electronic exchange with payers going for care coordination and really getting that involvement with their patients. So we're excited about it.
So all of you are no's. I get that. You could have told me earlier. Okay. So for one thing, I also wanted to, and I skipped this somehow, thank my co-chairs, Justin and Matt. Thanks. We do, when we have work groups, like co-chairs, a lot of times, because program manager, it's what I do, but I'm not necessarily a subject matter expert on anything mostly, but definitely not everything. So co-chairs are essential to how we do the work that we do, and being able to bounce off that information from you two has been really essential, so thank you for that. And just a thought to anyone else who wants to do that role within a Carequality work group, keep in mind that it's not a huge time investment. I'll bug you occasionally. Bill will probably do the same for his, but it's not a huge time investment, and it does really help push things along to make sure that we have that sounding board. So we've got about 6.5 minutes left. I don't know what the question protocol is. Okay, there's somebody in the back with a microphone. Anyone have any questions? Please don't
Jenny
throw
does.
tomatoes. Yeah.
So one unknown over here, of course, is what will respondents charge? What are the forces you contemplated are going to influence where the market lands or where individual provider organizations land as you think about that?
Anybody? Free for all. So,
I could jump in and say, I think there's a lot of unknowns there, as you point out, right? I think one of the things that, as we worked through this in the work group, that was brought up is like, we don't want to encourage that like per transaction rate. Like that's not the way that this is really built around. And so we called that out. But outside of that, I think there's a lot of unknowns in like where and how the folks and the organizations that are going to get involved are going to use the data and request it, and in what ways people are going to be able to get online to do it. So I think there's still a big question mark there. We don't want to dictate those fees because we need to ensure that I think there's flexibility here to actually, as Matt said earlier, meet folks where they are. But yeah, I don't think that we have a good answer for that yet. And if you have any suggestions, I mean, not that you don't know anything about this world either.
It was a tough question. Sorry, I started with the hard question.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's important from a Carequality perspective is understanding when we shouldn't dictate those things. We are the stewards of the trust framework, but that doesn't mean that we should think that we know everything, and getting that community feedback that we should just not touch it. Just let that go is part of that recognition. Sometimes you just have to let it go and see how it goes. I think, Zach, did you have a question? Or, oh, okay, never mind. I will not get in the way of people that know better.
She didn't ask my question. I don't have a question anymore.
I guess because the mic's right there, yeah.
Can you guys? Okay. Zach Finn, so I apologize, first of all, this might be a simple question that if I'd been more involved, I would have known, but I've been doing community-based exchange for about 15 years. Got involved with the eHealth exchange a couple years ago, and I'm kind of new to the Carequality world, which is why I'm here to learn. The way I hear you define care coordination used to be my definition of for treatment purposes. So what's changed? What am I missing? Is it just the expansion of the actors and their relationships?
Exactly,
Is that
yeah.
basically it?
Yeah, so we're going outside of a provider organization in this
Okay,
case.
so people that are still responsible for treating the patient, but they don't work directly for the treating provider, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, there was I'm sure most folks in this room, there was a very interesting proposal from the Office of Civil Rights or through HHS. I don't remember exactly who brought it out. I can't remember all the regulatory frameworks, where they talked a lot about care coordination as part of healthcare operations, right? There's that bigger picture of, there's a lot of other folks that get involved in care coordination activities. And if it isn't that direct care provider, there's kind of a gray area, you know, and I think through that clarification and what they put in that rule is like, well, we really intended this to be like treatment. And so we want folks to think of it that way. That obviously hasn't been finalized, but I think that's another one of the reasons why it was, I think, the safe space, as Brian said, to start with, is to say this is one where a lot of folks should be comfortable with it and understand and see that need for data to flow both ways. So yeah, that's where it came from. Right.
Yeah.
I think we have one back.
So first of all, thanks for all the comments. One of the things that is happening, obviously, is the rise of value-based care, and the number of care managers and care coordinators out there. I mean, this is very anecdotal, but I've heard that it's like 10x the number of users of those types that are out there than there were 10 years ago, because there is so much risk being put on various providers and payers, or the entities in between. So all the things I heard sounded like everyone's going to agree this is a good thing. We put the guardrails in place. So like, what's the counter argument right now? Which is like, why would people not do this?
I have more opinions. I think the big thing is, I think the big thing that we've seen as we've been working with folks goes back to that trust aspect. You say there are 10x times the number of care managers out there, right? There's a lot of organizations that, my local physician doesn't know. Like, I'll just use an example. I have an out-of-state insurance for where I am because of where our company headquarters are, right? They've contracted with a care management organization. If that care management organization calls my local provider in Minnesota, they don't know each other, right? It's a lot more challenging. And that's why we need to take that next step and add in some of this additional trust layer of the audits and other things that we're doing. We're specifying this is for care coordination to make sure we're breaking that out for all those reasons, to make sure that we can all trust each other. And I think that's really the challenge is yeah, it's 10x. I don't know who these people are. And so for me to feel comfortable, we need to make sure that we're doing this in the right way. Hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if you
There's
have
the
anything to
minimum
add.
necessary element as well,
That too, yep.
which is an extension of trust.
Right.
It's like, how do I trust that fulfilling a healthcare operations purpose, I'm just going to collect what I need to versus collect everything.
There's also the change as a four-letter word aspect sometimes too. But yeah, it really does boil down to trust and having the infrastructure in place to facilitate the exchange. The counter argument is, well, this is the way I've always done it, or this has worked for now. But healthcare is changing, it's evolving, it's eating a larger and larger portion of the economic pie here in the US. We need to get more efficient at it, and that's, I guess I'm counter-arguing the counter-argument already, but it's just having been in the interoperability space and seeing just have to build up that trust. It's something, it's intangible, and it was a great saying was, you gain trust in drops and you lose it in buckets. So we just need to make sure that we keep adding trust in these drop by drop by drop to get it to the point where people are comfortable with this new use case.
So I'm going to wrap things like I do every work group. I see that we're at time, and I want to respect everyone's time. But panel, thank you so much for your work on the work group, and also letting me lure you onto stage. That's
Thank you for having us.
great for me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.